Okay, morning Riverside. So I don't know if you've had this experience. I have. Maybe you're a mom, a dad, granny, grandpa. You've got a niece, a nephew, son or daughter. But you get that question, or you ask that question, what do you want for your birthday? Or what do you want for Christmas? Or what do you want when I come back from my trip? And you get that answer. Now, you don't always hear what you want them to share, but they share it with you anyway, and it breaks your bank balance. But you have love in your heart. You have compassion. So you go and buy that thing, right? And you come back home, and then you have the joy. You have the experience of giving that toy to this little snot nose that you love so much, right? And then, you know, your niece, your nephew, your daughter or your son or whatever, they take this toy and they go and they play and it's all awesome. You choke up, you cry, you blow your nose, you're like, all of this stuff happens. And then in my household, I wonder if it's unique to my household. All of a sudden there's tears, there's screaming, there's barking and biting, and there's blood. And you're into this scenario. I don't know if this scenario is familiar to any of you, but this scenario, it triggers all of us, doesn't it? Because the first thing that happens is one of these two, they come running to you and they say those words, tell her to share. Tell him to share, or it's mine. It's not yours. It's actually not yours. I bought it. I paid for it. You did nothing with it, and I gave it to you. I loaned it to you. I lent it to you. I just wish that you would just be a generous family that would look after one another. And then, inevitably, you solve the scenario. Someone wins, someone loses, but both lose because they're sitting in the corner all on their own with this fat lip and these tears in their eyes. And as a father, you just want to kill, don't you? You want to kill someone, but you don't share that because God sees and they see, and you got this Christian title and whatever. But I look at these families, and I look at these scenarios, and I look at my own family, I'm like, what is the antidote to greed? These little snot noses, they struggle with greed. It's in them. I see them. It happens every Christmas, every birthday, every time I come home from a trip. How does God heal greed? How does he heal it in our families? And how does he heal it in us? And so today we're going to look at an historical account where Jesus interacts with someone. You see, the character is referred to as someone. He doesn't have a name. His name isn't mentioned. His name isn't known to the community within which he exists. And we'll see how significant this becomes. But it says someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And so here we have this someone, probably the younger, more inferior person in the family, coming to Jesus and saying, "Tell my brother to share." Because maybe someone has passed away and things weren't specified in the will, and it's probably got to do with land. It's got to do with this estate, and generally the land would maybe go to the older brother, and so this is unjust. This younger person, maybe the sister, maybe the brother, I don't know, the inferior person wants land or wants this inheritance. And so this person comes to Jesus crying for justice, And is Jesus going to give justice? If you were Jesus, how would you answer this? And so Jesus replied, "Man," which probably means it's the younger brother, but this word man in the original language is very significant because it has this sense of displeasure. "Who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Now, this is really interesting because if I were Jesus, I would say, older brother, younger brother, split it 50-50, go halfway and go your way, right? The other thing that's surprising to me is that Jesus refers to himself as the judge. He says, "I've come to judge." He says, "I'm going to be the eternal judge. I am the judge." And now he's saying, "Who's appointed me to be your judge?" Like, hey, I'm not your arbiter. I'm not your judge. I'm not here to divide and deal with this. So, Jesus, are you the judge or aren't you the judge? What's going on? Now my pastor's confused me. How do I worship you? You know? And that's what the Bible's supposed to do. But I think what's going on here is that Jesus is saying, in this sense, I want to deal with the real issue. You know, I'm here to bring relationships together. I'm here to bring peace in this family, peace to such a degree that you guys can work this out as you walk forward. What I really see in your cry for justice is actual greed. That's what I really see. When you come to me with your shopping list, when you come to me and you pray these new prayers, when you come to me as God and you pray, God, please sort out that person so that I can get more, so that I can get half, so that I can, you know what you're really doing? You're using me. You're using me. You're using God. Do we use God? When we look at our prayer life, when we look at why we come to church, when we look at why we come to God, because we have this shopping list, and God is like, I'm not that kind of judge. I'm not here to be used. I'm here to be worshipped. And that's what's going on here. And so he says to this younger brother who wants more, and potentially this person is coming with the fear that all of us carry in our hearts. Well, I carry it in my heart. Am I going to have enough? Don't we carry that fear? I don't know if I'm going to have enough. So I need an RA, I need policies, I need to store and save, and because I don't think that I'm going to have enough. And this younger brother is crying out for justice, saying, I need an inheritance, because he feels like he doesn't have enough. That's the scenario that this request is coming from. And Jesus peels back the curtain of his life and says, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And here's the real issue in this person's life, greed. You want more apps, you want more clothes, you want more stuff, you want more money, you want half of this inheritance, you're coming and using me in my relationship with God because you just want. You come with your shopping list, all kinds of greed, not just material, but this is the characteristic potentially of this someone's life. Jesus says, watch out and be on your guard, because life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Will Smith says that too many people spend money they haven't earned to buy things they don't need to impress people they don't like. It's a great definition of greed. And Jesus is saying that life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. When we look at Hollywood, when we look at really wealthy people, when we look at soccer players, when we look at stinking rich professionals, when we track and follow their lives, and then we look at their backstories, don't we discover life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions? Are you happier when you are wealthy? Are you happier when you have this? I saw on one of these, someone had this funeral, and the phrase on the order of service was, the one who dies with the most toys is the happiest. And Jesus is saying, is that true? Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions, but do we believe that? Do we really think that? Do we need to engage with that and sit there a little bit? Watch out and be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Very interesting that there was a pastor who did a series on the 7 deadly sins. And as he addressed the issue of greed, his wife said to him, you know, when it comes to that topic, your church is going to be the emptiest. And she was right. Why? Because when we fall in the area of relationships, we all know it. When we murder, it's clear to everyone. When we lie, it's clear. It's clear to us, it's clear to them. But when it comes to greed, no one here today thinks that they are greedy. None of us think that we battle with greed. It's like this hidden reality. And when we talk about this kind of topic, well, we all think, I don't need to be at that talk. And yet Jesus says, watch out. The way that you secure your home with beams, with an electric fence, with dogs, with alarm codes, with panic buttons, to watch out when there's an intruder in your home, to be on your guard. That's how we need to be in this area of more of greed. All kinds of greed. A way in which we can do that is to ask questions when we budget, when we think about what do I want to buy this week, when we think about our organizations, when we come to those budget discussions. What do we need? What do we want? How much are we spending? Where are we spending? Why are we buying what we are buying? Ask questions. Let your partner ask questions. Interact with this scenario. That's one of the ways in which we can watch out and be on your guard. So this guy comes to Jesus asking for this inheritance to be divided. And Jesus engages with the real issue of potential greed and not justice. And then he tells this parable. And he told them this parable, the ground of a certain rich man. So this someone probably looks at wealthier people and thinks that I want that life. And Jesus says, well, let me tell you about someone who has that life. This rich man yielded an abundant harvest. It could have been the way that he worked. It could have been through a donation or gift. It could have been through nature and circumstances. But whatever happened, he yields this abundant harvest. And then it says, he starts dialoguing with himself. He starts interacting with his soul. He starts contemplating and asking himself a critical question. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. It's a great question. What shall I do? It's actually a question of purpose. It's this question of a grander vision. And when you think about it, when your company is more profitable, or you yield a greater harvest, or you get a gift, or something changes in your life, or this someone, let's say he received this inheritance. The question we should ask is, what should I do? Now he has a few options. He can either hide the wealth, or he can go and flaunt it to everyone in the name of acceptance and importance. He can go and spend it on experiences. He can upgrade. He can upgrade a lot in his life. Or he can show the banks that he has wealth, and he can go into greater levels of debt. Another option is that he can pretend. He can pretend that he's poor to everybody else while he sits on this pile of money. What shall I do is a great question. Does he include God into this scenario? Does he ask God, what shall I do? I don't know. I don't think so. The parable goes on. Then he said to himself, you know what? This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and I'll build larger ones. You see, I'll look at my barns, I'll look at my reality, and I'll tear them down. And because I've come into so much surplus, I'll build bigger ones, larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my possessions, so that he can walk into his barns, and then he stores everything, and he sees his boats, and he sees his cars, and he sees his clothes, and he sees his devices, and he sees his apps, and he sees his grain, and he puts everything in his bigger barns, everything, not something, but all of my stuff. And then he can maybe just admire all of this stuff. That's his plan. Why does he do this? What's the fear? What's going on here? And I'll say to myself, soul, see, here he's interacting with the deep kind of the making of who he is. Soul, you have many possessions stored up. When I look into the future, you have many possessions now that you've stored up for many years. For next week, for next month, for next year, for the next 10 years. You've got all your grain and all your possessions stored up. And then you can live the dream. Relax, eat, drink, and celebrate. Because there is this fear in this someone who is coming to Jesus saying, will I have enough? Will God provide for me? Now I have an opportunity to accumulate and to store and to cash in on my RA policies, on my life policies, on my savings, and put it all into my bonds. You know what I'm saying? And then I can relax and just breathe a little for many, many, many years. And then this parable turns on its head, because this wealthy person who's kind of going about life in this way, trying to medicate this fear in his or her heart, didn't think about reality. What shall I do with this inheritance? What shall I do with this abundant harvest? Didn't think about reality in the way that God wanted this person to think about. The financial advisor forgot to share what Jesus is now going to speak into this scenario. But God said to him, "You fool." Is it "you fool"? Or is it "you fool"? Or is it "you fool"? But I think it's the only time in Scripture that God calls someone a fool. This person who is thinking within themselves, contemplating, deciding, reading, wrestling with thoughts inside themselves, Jesus said, what you're about to do now might actually be a foolish way of living in light of the real dynamics of life, the way that life really works. You fool, this very night, after you've stored, after you've gathered, after you've built bigger, larger, after you look at all, and you think you're going to live where the grass is greener on the other side, and you're going to have many, many, many years, you fool, this very night, tonight, your life will be demanded from you. You see, this verse has really struck me. I want us even to memorize and think about it this very night. Tonight, your life will be demanded from you. This could be your last worship service. I was interacting with someone, we were talking about the rugby on a Sunday. The next Sunday, he had gone to be with the Lord. This very night, your life could be demanded from you. This week, I was thinking about it, and the Lord brought 5 names, at least, where I'd heard so-and-so had passed away. So-and-so has passed away. This very night, your life will be demanded from you. And this language in the original language has the metaphor of a loan, that God has loaned you this life, and now there's a repayment to be made. And in this rich person's profitability, there's this thought of, I have pulled this off and they are my toys. And even my very soul and life, it belongs to me. And Jesus is saying, this very night, your life will be demanded from you. The second dynamic is, and then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Who's going to get all that you've earned and stored, your barn, your grain, all of that? Who's it going to go to? And you might say, I've written my will. Or you might say, I haven't got my will in order. I don't know. I haven't really, I have this assumption that I'll just keep living on forever and ever and ever. Whatever that scenario, who's it going to go to? And you might say, no, it's going to my family and dependents. And how are they going to look after everything that you've worked for? What if you could see into the future and say, oh my gosh, I made all these wise decisions and here they are, they're just flushing it down the toilet. And generation from generation, it just kind of dissipates into nothing. God wants us to think about these things. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. And this verse is interesting. To be rich toward God. It's this word of to be generous toward God. It's the opposite of greed and of accumulation. It's this idea of letting go and of asking the question when you say, what shall I do? It's to include God into that scenario and to say, how do I be generous like God is generous? To be generous toward God. And in fact, one of the versions struck me. It said, to gather for God. How do you not gather for yourself, and how do you gather for God? And I think the idea is this, that what moves from this reality into the next reality is people. People, the souls of people. And so how do you use the gifts and your life in a way on the thing that matters most to God, which is you? It's people. To be generous in that kind of way. And so what do we notice as Jesus interacts with this someone who has this fear and is coming to Jesus with this cry for justice, but Jesus sees it potentially to fuel and fund greed? What are some of the characteristics that we notice in this story? Firstly, that Jesus says that greed is something that we all think we don't battle with. And he says, watch out and be on your guard and ask questions and look at your heart and look at your life. When we cry for justice, really, are we crying for justice, or are we crying so that we might gain more? The second thing that we notice in this parable is that the word I is mentioned 12 times. I, me, my. Jesus refers to this person as man, as someone, has no identity, has no name to God, because it's all about him. It's this pursuit of individualism. This parable would have been spoken to this person in the context of a village. And in that day and age, you would not have made a decision without considering or asking your family, your friends, your immediate family, and even your village. But here you see in this parable that this person is dialoguing with himself. He views everything in relationship to him. Isn't it interesting in wealthier communities, in wealthier countries, in first world areas, that there's this move to individualism? The walls get higher, and our ideas move to mine and me and I. But there's a real sense of playing in the sandpit all by myself. I don't know who sang that song, but it could be your song. And we notice this idea of storing to medicate this fear for our future. And it's this idea of storing everything. Now, Jesus is not saying give everything, but he's also not saying store everything. There might be wisdom in storing some things, but this parable is all and everything in one place. And as we secure our futures, it's the very thing that we are unable to ever secure. And so what is the antidote to greed? And when I think about the picture that I showed in the beginning, you see, I wonder if our Father in heaven, he looks at us today, and does he see this in his children? Does he see this sense of mine, of in our prayer life, tell him or tell her to share, of loneliness, of ladder climbing, of accumulating and of storing? When he looks at the church across the country, when he looks at communities of faith all throughout the world, when he looks at the Western church, is this potentially a picture of his children? This picture of not letting go of mine, and it's characterized by fighting and bitterness and biting and bleeding and not generosity, and not the very character of the God that these communities are designed to worship. So what is the antidote to greed? How does Jesus speak potentially into the spirit of us, of me, of these communities of faith, of those that confess his name? I think there are two things that are an antidote to greed. The first thing, a sober reality, is death. Think about those words. This very night, your life will be demanded from you. I've shared that I have a family member who was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer last year. The doctor sat this person down after the scans had been shown and said, you have 8 weeks to live. We bought emergency tickets and went to the UK, and we gave our living eulogy with tears around the table. We thanked this person for who this person was in our lives and in the life of this family. And I want to say that after this diagnosis, nothing changed, but everything changed. You see, it's really interesting that he was told that he had 8 weeks to live. A miracle has happened, and I'm not saying, the doctors have said this is a miracle. He has lived for 12 months. You see, nothing has changed, but everything has changed. The way that he interacts with his friends, the way that he is using his resources, the phone calls that he makes, the letters that he writes, the prayers that he's praying, the way that he has designed his funeral. He is bound for heaven. But it is like he has stepped from one reality into another. And he's interacting with people and with NGOs and with family and with grandchildren and with everything so differently. Because of this real dynamic, this very night, your life will be demanded from you. Now, I want to say that tonight or today, this morning, I am your medical doctor in a sense. Jesus is our medical doctor. And he says to us, to me, those words, you have pancreatic cancer. This very night, your life will be demanded from you. We live in this reality. And my prayer is that we would sit with those words and with that dynamic. And we would think about our wills. We would think about our souls. We would look at our family members and our friends and our children. And we would do a little bit of planning. We would do a sober assessment in light of this truth. It's not fun. It's not something we all like talking about. We like sanitizing it, thinking that we will live for many, many, many years. But as we listen to this reality and live wisely, I pray that it would change the way in which we steward our life. Like the song says, one more day, Lord, one more day. And to steward our life faithfully with freedom in light of that reality. This is a real antidote to greed. The second thing that Jesus speaks about is to be generous. You see, this idea of emptying our barns. The way in which we cure and heal greed is to be generous. And it comes from the words, be rich toward God. Now, I know that as we end this series and close this series, you're sitting there like me saying, here comes the left hook. Here comes the church asking for my money. Now, I want to be clear. In one sense, I don't really care about your money. What I care about for every single one of us, including myself, is that God knows our name, is that we have a personal relationship with God, and that we see victory, that I see victory in this area of greed. And the antidote that we all come under today is to be rich towards God, to be generous toward God. And when we ask the question, when we come into profitability, or we get that salary, or God looks and provides after us, and we say, what shall I do? That we include God into that reality. And I'm saying, if God lays it on your heart to be generous to the poor, be generous to the poor. If God lays it on your heart to be generous to an NGO, be generous to an NGO. If He lays it on your heart to fund a missionary in the middle of nowhere, bringing the gospel of grace to people who don't know God, then follow that prompting. What I am concerned about is that we be generous towards God, because this matters to God. Now, an avenue to that, and not the only avenue to that, is to be generous to your local church, who with wisdom and prudence you're watching, you're discerning, you're asking questions, you're engaging with, but maybe you get a sense and you see, these guys are on mission. They're about healing the world. They're about serving their communities. They're about creating environments where people can engage with the generous, gracious God. And if you come to that point, then we want to give you an avenue, not the avenue, to empty your barns, to be generous towards God. But ultimately, this is about you and God, not about you and the pastor or you and the church. And it is in that context that we have this 3-month tithing challenge. We are saying, be generous toward God and watch God at work in your life. See if you can see tangible signs and wonders in your life of how God is interacting with you personally, that you are not just an unnameable name to Him. And so I wanted to close this series with a real raw testimony from someone in our midst. And I'm going to keep this person anonymous. But this person identifies for me with the stuff of life in terms of what we all battle with. This person says, "Dear Grace Riverside Ministry Team, I've been meaning to write this email for a while. And so the last day of this year seems a fitting time. In May, this is last year, I attended a sermon about tithing. It was a very insightful sermon that unpacked where tithing comes from. I've been a Christian all my life and have attended church for most of it. And this was the best sermon on tithing that I had heard yet, a notoriously difficult subject to preach on. What's amazing here is that I didn't even preach that series, so praise God. The sermon ended with an urge to those who used to tithe but had stopped to try it again for 3 months and see what happens. As I fell into this category, I decided to give it a try. I did it the first month and fell short in our budget, about the same amount as what I tithed, and had to borrow money from my husband to cover the shortfall, which in turn created a shortfall in his budget. Now there's tension in the family. I tithed again the second month, but again fell short in our budget and then decided I couldn't keep it up as it wasn't fair to my husband to bail us out when he didn't have the funds to do so. I did not tithe the third month. Don't we all battle with this? I was sure, though, that I was meant to see this through and wondered about the situation. In the third month, my brother paid my husband and me X amount to help us with funds for immigrating. My husband and I decided about 2 weeks later that we weren't ready to immigrate. I won't go into the details, but my brother said that I could keep the money, even though that we were no longer immigrating. And here I was with X amount, so I paid the third month tithe. On one hand, I felt that I should not spend the money, but then, on the other hand, I thought that all the money is from God, and that it was He who had opened up this avenue for us. A bit more than a month later, I was called in at work to my boss's office and told that I was earning too little and that my salary would be increased with X amount a month from January 2020, and that I would still get an annual increase on top of that. My boss said they would do the same in 2021. This was like a dream. I could hardly believe it, except that I could believe it because our God is able to do what we dare not even dream. What favor the Lord grants us who often have so little faith. And that really is me. That's you. That's us. I've had on my heart for quite a while to share this testimony with you, and I feel quite nervous doing so. But I hope that I'm doing what I feel prompted to do. Thank you for all the work that you do as a church. Kind regards. I pray that there will be an encouragement. And I pray that as God heals us with our battles of greed, that He would give us many avenues to empty our bonds, and that we would see the God who is a God of signs and wonders, intervening and interacting in our personal relationship with Him. Because at the end of the day, that's what really matters to Him, to me, and to us. Let's pray together.